All right, we are now in the bijou area, which is where we have all sorts of decorating using jewelry of things like hats or clothing or the actual making of jewelry, which is incorporated into the shows. And we're with Susan Richards, who's now here and looking at one of the scenes in The Music Man. And it's an unusual project you have going here. Can you tell us about it?
Well, it's fun. We're making motifs that it will be applied to the suede tops of the costume and matching beads, so they step the colours nice and bold, and it will look good on the Avon stage.
That's right. I mean, these are costumes. In the number there is a number which we call the Watanyi, which is basically the young girls of the community, which is almost like the guides, or they're kind of like, they all have their little sororities and lodges, and this is the Watanyi, and they're dressed in a sort of, the only word to call it is ersatz, sort of native kind of costume, which is kind of made up. At the time it was very fashionable. I mean, you see pictures, all these things of Native Americans, they were very fashionable in people's homes. So in 1912, this would be just the sort of thing that the ladies' auxiliary would get together and make.
So when you do this, did you actually research the ersatz materials of the time, or did you just make this up?
Well,
we rather made it up.
We made it up.
All right. That's okay. That's a good answer.
It's from Patrick's sketch. We realised instead of looking for real beadwork that his sketch was right on. So we created the little motifs from the sketch.
Well, and as I said, you know, when I think of when I was a kid and we went to do pageants in grade 3, my grandmother went to the local store and she would have got yellow rickrack and sewed it on, or she would have got felt and glued things on, and that's all it was, because it was only going to be for one number. So I said, well, let's think of it from that approach. You have to give an authenticity of where it comes from a bit, as to these people who have created it. Is, well, where would they get some of these things, and how could they? And never underestimate, you know, the amount of work that people did in 1912 on a costume, because they had the time and the patience to make all these things. So, but I said it's also got to be seen from 20 feet back, because that's probably your closest person. So again, these things have to have the quite punchy colors, and I see these bits of turquoise will pop on a set, which is largely white, as I say. So these are great, actually. I love them.
It's going to be delightful, and I'd like to try some of this on afterwards we finish shooting this. In any case, Susan, thank you very much. Patrick, thank you. This has been delightful. Okay, so those were beautiful costumes, Patrick, and we even got that comment from one of the viewers, how beautiful they are.
Yes, it was very kind already.
Let's take a step back, though, and go to the very first question that was asked, and it was about designing both the set and the costumes. What are the differences between the two fields for you?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I always do both. I have done separate pieces, and so people quite often will say, which do you like best? And they're very different kind of entities in many ways. I mean, when you design, you usually start always with the set, because you've got to create the world that the people exist in, even though in your mind you may begin to see those people inhabit that world. But you have to kind of create a space that I hope is, first of all, visually exciting for people to see, furthers the plot of the story, and also that is friendly for the actors to use, in a sense, to make it their own. I had a very good comment from one of the actors in one of the fittings who said, the set is lovely, nothing is in our way, which is a compliment, really, because he said sometimes it's not that way.
Right. And do you think most designers, if they're doing both, begin with the set in mind?
I think so. I mean, if only for the practical reason that when you usually sign your contract and your dates come in, usually the set is the first thing to be built. So your set is always kind of where the world begins. You create the background, so then your costumes have to sit in front of it. So then you know when you start your costumes what that world is behind you. So again, you know what the color palette is, for example.
Well, the color is an interesting point, because you've got a group of actors standing on stage against a dark background, a light background. In this case, it's almost an off-white world, right?
Yes.
How did you arrive at that?
Well, I think when Susan and I first talked about the show, and I quite often do this with many directors, I'll just say, give me an artist, name me. Or this started years ago, a director used to give me a postcard and used to say, I don't know what it is about this I like, but I like it. And you had to then go away and interpret what it is they liked. So I asked Susan, and she went, Andrew Wyeth, and I went, okay, that's an interesting choice.
Right.
And that dovetailed very well into the story. If you know a bit of the background about the Music Man and the fact that it takes place in Iowa, and Grant Wood, the famous American painter from the 20th century, the famous American Gothic, which most people know with the man with the pitchfork and the lady beside him in the apron. That is sort of one of the sort of icons of that period and of that time. And so in the background is that little white clapboard house. And so I started with that, but I kept thinking, every time you do a show, you have to try to tell it differently, still respect it, but still make it as fresh as you can for each period to look at it, and every eye is going to look at it. I mean, if you did a show in 1950, probably people thought it was cutting edge. We would look at it now and say it looks old and dated in 1950s.
Right.
So no matter what, that's what it does. I said the good thing is 50 years from now, you'll look at it again, you'll say, oh, isn't that wonderful, because we have a different eye looking at 100 years from now. So when I started it, I just started thinking linear. I started thinking white clapboard, but then I started thinking, well, let's look at the negative spaces. Let's look at the shadow lines that clapboards create when sunlight goes on them. And so the whole set is off-white, and then Susan, as soon as she saw it, I had some gauzes and some scrims, she said, I want to see through it all. So she and I both love the sense of your eye being able to continue moving through, and the sort of the mystery of sort of seeing things but not quite seeing things on sets, and being able to bleed through and transition in a kind of sometimes cinematographic kind of way, because whether we like it or not, you know, films inspire us, and the way things are done nowadays, you have to change your staging to reflect that a bit.
Patrick, so that's the set end of the spectrum, and I want to ask you about things like the movable houses later.
Right.
But so then what about the costumes? Because that was the other part of the question here, the difference in the two fields. So then how do you decide the right way to make the costumes stand out against that set?
Well, I always say that, first of all, the biggest difference between costumes and set is the variable, because when you do the set, generally speaking, you know, once the set is done, people work around it, with it, or whatever, but a costume has to sit on an actor's body. It is the extension of their character. They have to feel comfortable, they have to feel good. I always say, even if you're in rags and you're coming on stage as a pauper, you should feel good in your rags. So then, having set myself the dilemma of an all-white set, and then talking to Susan, and Susan saying she wanted it to be cool and light. She said, it's Iowa, it's in July. I then suddenly went, oh, I've kind of backed myself a bit into a corner, because a lot of clothing in those days would have been white.
Right.
It would have been natural linen, cottons, anything to keep you cool. So you then have to move into, and then she'd also made she said, we don't want to see red till the band comes on stage at the end of the show. So you've lost basically white, you've kind of lost a lot of your colors. She didn't want it to be too brown, and she didn't want it to look like autumn, so you had to kind of go to blues and greens and pinks and peaches and colors that I've not used that much of, quite frankly, in Shakespeare's.
Right.
So then you have to, you know, make certain that those colors are light enough, the fabrics are light enough, yet strong enough to read as a color on a white background, and then put trim on them so they pop out even more.
So Patrick, we just got a question. Which will be more dominant, the set or the costumes? I'm thinking of Into the Woods, the viewer says, with white sets and colorful costumes. So what will be the effect then that you're looking for?
I think it's interesting they should say Into the Woods, because Into the Woods was an all white, it was white, black and red if I remember, but most of it was white. And I would say in some ways there's probably similarities. The difference being much of Oklahoma is outside, so you have a nice bright blue sky behind everything.
Right.
The colors in the costumes are there. A lot of it has white, and in fact we've gone for pure white so that it does bounce out against the soft white in the background. But also you have to kind of, you know, make it all work with the lighting. And hopefully with Kevin, we've done a lot of talking about the fact that because it's linear, because the sets are stacked, he has lots of opportunity to side light, which is usually the best light for dance.
I see.
Because it tends to pop the body off from the scenery behind. And so hopefully the color of the costumes plus the side lighting will allow them to kind of glow out from the sort of the background in the white.